The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon when Frank Henderson's alarm clock rang at exactly 6:15 a.m. At 93 years old, Frank didn't need an alarm to wake up anymore. His body was used to this schedule after decades of military service. But old habits died hard, and Frank believed in staying disciplined. His small but tidy bedroom showed signs of his military background. His bed was made with perfect hospital corners, and his medals from World War II hung in a simple wooden frame on the wall. A black and white photo of his late wife Martha sat on the bedside table, her kind smile watching over him every morning as he started his day. Frank moved slowly but purposefully through his morning routine. His hands shook slightly as he buttoned his crisp blue shirt and pulled on his neatly pressed khaki pants. Every piece of clothing was arranged in his closet according to color and type, just as he had done for the past 70 years. He carefully combed his thin white hair and straightened his collar in the mirror, nodding with satisfaction at his neat appearance. The old veteran picked up his polished wooden cane from its place beside the door. The cane had been a gift from his grandson 5 years ago, carved from strong oak with a Marine Corps emblem carefully etched into its handle. Frank didn't like needing help to walk, but he had learned to accept it with the same grace he approached everything else in life. At precisely 6:45 a.m., Frank stepped out of his small white house on Maple Street. The morning air was crisp and cool, typical for a spring day in Small Plains, Nebraska. He began his daily walk to Mary's Corner Cafe, taking the same route he had walked for the past 60 years. The newspaper boy, Tommy, waved from his bicycle as he passed. Mrs. Johnson, watering her flowers, called out a cheerful good morning. Frank tipped his head politely to everyone he met. He might be moving slower these days, but his manners never faltered. Mary's Corner Cafe came into view at 6:55 a.m. The small diner hadn't changed much since it opened in 1962. The red and white striped awning was a bit faded now, and the neon sign flickered sometimes, but to Frank, it was perfect. The bell above the door chimed as he pushed it open at exactly 7 a.m. "Morning, Frank." Sarah, the waitress, called out with a warm smile. She had already set up his usual spot at the counter, the third stool from the left, where he could see both the door and the street through the large front window. A habit from his military days that he never quite shook off. "Good morning, Sarah," Frank replied in his deep, gentle voice. He carefully hung his light jacket on the hook beneath the counter, the same hook he'd been using since Sarah's mother had worked here. Without having to ask, Sarah placed a steaming cup of black coffee and a plate with 2 pieces of perfectly toasted wheat bread in front of him. The coffee cup was Frank's special mug, a slightly chipped ceramic piece with the Marine Corps logo that the diner had kept just for him since 1985. As Frank stirred a single packet of sugar into his coffee, he looked around the familiar diner. The morning regulars were all in their usual spots. Bill Thompson reading his newspaper in the corner booth, Betty Williams sipping her tea by the window, and Joe the mailman having his quick breakfast before starting his route. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, mixing with the quiet murmur of conversation and the soft clinking of plates and cups. Frank took a small notebook from his pocket, another military habit he'd kept. Every morning, he would write down the date and weather, just as he had done during his service. His handwriting wasn't as steady as it used to be, but the words were still neat and clear. Today's entry read, Thursday, April 15th, 2025. Clear skies, light breeze from the northeast. 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The peaceful morning at Mary's Corner Cafe suddenly changed when the sound of loud motorcycle engines filled the air. The noise grew louder and louder until the whole diner seemed to shake. 5 large motorcycles, their chrome pipes gleaming in the morning sun, pulled into the parking lot. The bikes were black and massive, with skull designs painted on their fuel tanks. Sarah, the waitress, nearly dropped her coffee pot when she saw the bikers through the window. They were all big men, dressed in black leather jackets covered in patches and metal studs. Their boots made heavy sounds on the pavement as they walked toward the diner's entrance. The bell above the door rang 5 times as the bikers entered one by one. The leader was the tallest, maybe 6 feet 4 inches, with a thick black beard and dark sunglasses. A red bandana covered his head, and chains hung from his jean pockets. Behind him came 4 others. A bald man with tattoos on his neck, 2 younger guys with long hair tied back in ponytails, and a heavy-set man wearing a vest with Road Warriors written across the back. The regular customers at Mary's grew very quiet. Bill Thompson slowly folded his newspaper and placed it on the table, his eyes watching the bikers carefully. Betty Williams stopped stirring her tea, and Joe the mailman quickly paid his bill and left through the side door. The bikers looked around the diner, their boots squeaking on the clean floor. Then they saw Frank sitting alone at the counter. The leader nudged one of the ponytailed men and grinned. They walked over to the counter, deliberately spreading out to take up all the space around Frank's seat. "Hey, look what we got here, boys," the leader said in a loud voice that echoed through the quiet diner. "Seems like we found ourselves a retirement home instead of a cafe." His friends laughed roughly at his joke. The bald biker dropped heavily onto the stool next to Frank, making it screech against the floor. He spread his elbows wide on the counter, bumping Frank's coffee cup and making some of it spill. Frank quietly took his napkin and wiped up the spill, not looking at the bikers. "Excuse me, old-timer," the bald man said with fake politeness, "but you're taking up all the good seats. Why don't you move down to the end of the counter? Or better yet, maybe it's time for your morning nap." Sarah stepped forward from behind the counter, her face red with anger. "Now listen here," she started to say, but Frank raised his hand slightly, signaling her to stop. She bit her lip and stepped back, but kept watching with worried eyes. The other bikers spread out more, creating a half circle around Frank. The heavy-set one deliberately bumped Frank's stool as he passed, making the old veteran grab the counter to steady himself. The two ponytailed bikers snickered and started making loud comments about the smell of old people and how early bird specials were for chickens. The leader leaned against the counter right next to Frank, so close that his leather jacket brushed against Frank's clean blue shirt. He picked up Frank's special Marine Corps coffee mug and looked at it with a mocking smile. Well, looks like we got ourselves a military man. Tell me, Gramps, did you fight in the Civil War?" The other bikers burst out laughing at this joke. The diner had become so quiet that you could hear the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught the medals pinned to the bikers' jackets, showing off their mock military decorations. The contrast between their fake medals and the real service pins on Frank's collar was clear to everyone watching. Betty Williams had her hand on her phone, ready to call the police. Bill Thompson had stood up from his booth, though he wasn't sure what he could do against 5 large bikers. Sarah stood frozen behind the counter, her hands gripping a coffee pot so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Frank continued eating his breakfast quietly, cutting his toast into small, neat squares just as he had done every morning for the past 60 years. His hands remained steady despite the bikers crowding around him. The leader of the group watched Frank's calm behavior with growing irritation, as if the old veteran's peace was somehow an insult. "Hey boys," the leader called out, his voice getting louder. "Maybe Grant but here is hard of hearing. Should we speak up?" He leaned in closer to Frank's ear and almost shouted, "Can you hear me now, old T-I-N-E-R?" The other bikers laughed, but their laughter had a mean edge to it. The bald one reached over and knocked Frank's wooden cane from where it was hooked on the counter's edge. The polished oak cane clattered to the floor and rolled under a nearby table. Sarah gasped from behind the counter, but before she could move to help, the heavy-set biker blocked her path. "I'll get that for you, Gramps," one of the ponytailed bikers said with fake kindness. "But it's gonna cost you. How about buying breakfast for me and my friends?" He didn't make any move to actually pick up the cane. Frank slowly finished chewing his piece of toast and took a small sip of his coffee. His face remained calm, but anyone watching closely might have noticed how his jaw tightened slightly. The Marine Corps pin on his collar caught the morning light as he carefully set down his coffee cup. The leader grabbed Frank's coffee cup and held it up, pretending to examine it. "Nice mug you got here, Marine," he said, turning it around in his hands. "Wonder how easily it breaks." His fingers tightened around the ceramic. Betty Williams couldn't stay quiet any longer. "That's enough," she called out from her table. "Leave him alone, or I'm calling the police." The bald biker turned toward her, his face dark with anger. "Mind your own business, lady, unless you want trouble too." Betty's hand shook as she gripped her phone, but she didn't back down. "The lady's right," Bill Thompson said, standing up from his booth. Though he was in his 60s, he drew himself up to his full height. "This isn't right," picking on an elderly veteran. The bikers exchanged amused looks. "Well, look here," the leader sneered. "Seems like the retirement home has a whole bunch of heroes." He deliberately tilted Frank's coffee cup, letting some of the hot liquid spill onto the counter. The dark coffee spread across the clean surface, reaching the edge of Frank's plate. Sarah had managed to edge around the heavy-set biker and was now reaching for the phone behind the counter. The leader saw her movement and slammed Frank's coffee cup down hard. Coffee splashed everywhere, some of it landing on Frank's clean blue shirt. "Don't even think about it, sweetheart," the leader warned Sarah. "This is just a friendly conversation between us veterans. Right, Gramps?" He put his hand heavily on Frank's shoulder, squeezing it. The diner had become so quiet that everyone could hear the soft ticking of the wall clock and the gentle hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. The morning sun that had made the diner seem so peaceful earlier now felt hot and harsh through the windows. Frank looked down at his coffee-stained shirt. For the first time since the bikers had entered, he moved with purpose. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, reached slowly into his back pocket. The bikers tensed, perhaps expecting him to pull out a weapon. The leader's hand tightened on Frank's shoulder. But what Frank withdrew wasn't a weapon at all. It was his worn leather wallet, its brown surface smooth and darkened by decades of use. The bikers watched, a mix of curiosity and mockery on their faces as Frank's fingers moved to open it. "What you got in there, old-timer?" the leader asked, his voice dripping with fake interest. "Your social security card, or maybe some pictures of your grandkids." With steady hands that seemed to contradict his age, Frank opened his wallet. The leather creaked softly as he reached into a hidden pocket behind where he kept his dollars. The bikers watched, still smirking, as his fingers carefully pulled out an old photograph. The edges were worn smooth from years of handling, and the paper had turned slightly yellow with age. "Got something you want to show us, old-timer?" the leader asked, his voice thick with mockery. The other bikers moved closer, expecting to see a picture of grandchildren or maybe an old military portrait they could laugh at. Frank didn't speak. Instead, he carefully placed the photograph on the coffee-stained counter and smoothed it flat with one wrinkled hand. The image was in black and white, but even after all these years, it remained sharp and clear. The bald biker leaned forward to get a better look, and his smirk slowly faded. The photograph showed a younger Frank standing in front of a group of tough-looking Marines. He wore a crisp instructor's uniform with special combat training patches on the shoulders. The date stamped in the corner read June 15, 1973, and beneath it was written Camp Pendleton, Marine Corps Advanced Combat Training Division. But what caught the biker's attention wasn't just Frank in his uniform. It was the group of men standing around him, at least 50 elite Marines, all looking fierce and ready for action. Their faces showed the kind of toughness that only comes from intense training. And there, in the center, stood Frank, looking strong and commanding. The leader's hand loosened its grip on Frank's shoulder as he stared at the photo. His face changed from mocking to uncertain as he read the text at the bottom of the picture. Master Sergeant Frank Henderson, Lead Combat Instructor, Special Forces Hand-to-Hand Combat Training Program. The heavy-set biker moved closer, his eyes growing wide. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice losing its aggressive tone. "Henderson, as in Hurricane Henderson." Frank nodded slowly, speaking for the first time since the harassment began. His voice was quiet but clear. "That's what some of the men called me back then." The bald biker had gone pale. He stepped back from the counter, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Hurricane Henderson, the guy who wrote the Marine Corps Hand-to-Hand Combat Manual?" Sarah, who had never heard this story in all her years of serving Frank breakfast, watched in amazement as the mood in the diner shifted. The two ponytailed bikers looked at each other nervously, their earlier confidence disappearing. Frank picked up the photograph and pointed to a young Marine standing next to him in the picture. "This man here," he said calmly, "went on to become a general. And this one," his finger moved to another face, "trained 3 generations of Special Forces operatives." His voice carried no pride or boasting, just simple facts. The leader had taken off his sunglasses now, and his face showed a mix of shock and embarrassment. He looked at the combat training patches in the photograph, then at the small pins on Frank's collar, seeing them with new understanding. "In my 27 years of service," Frank continued, his voice still gentle but carrying the weight of authority, "I trained over 3,000 Marines in advanced combat techniques. Some of my methods are still being taught today." He paused, looking directly at the leader for the first time. "In fact, if any of you served in the Marines within the last 40 years, you probably learned some of them yourselves." The photograph made its way around the group of bikers, each one handling it with increasing respect as they realized whose presence they were in. The regular customers of the diner watched in amazement as the once threatening group of men seemed to shrink, their tough exteriors cracking under the weight of Frank's quiet revelation. Betty Williams had lowered her phone, no longer feeling the need to call the police. Bill Thompson sat back down in his booth, a small smile of satisfaction on his face. Sarah stood behind the counter, her hands clasped together, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of pride and awe. The morning sun had moved higher in the sky, casting a warm glow through Mary's cafe's windows. The atmosphere in the diner had completely changed. The tension that had filled the air just minutes before was replaced by a respectful silence as Frank began to speak about his service years. "I joined the Marines when I was 17, Frank said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet diner. "That was in 1949, just after World War II ended. Nobody in my family thought I'd last more than a month." A small smile crossed his weathered face at the memory. The leader of the bikers had pulled up a stool, his earlier aggression replaced by genuine interest. The others had also gathered around, their body language now showing respect instead of threat. Even the regular customers of the diner leaned in closer to hear Frank's story. "During my first year," Frank continued, "my commanding officer noticed something about the way I handled myself in training. He said I had a gift for teaching others." Frank paused to take a sip from the fresh cup of coffee Sarah had brought him. "Next thing I knew, I was being sent to special instructor training." The bald biker raised his hand slightly, like a student in class. "Sir," he said, the word coming naturally now, "I heard stories about your training methods during my time in the Corps. They said you could teach anyone to defend themselves, no matter their size." Frank nodded. "That's right. I believed every Marine needed to be confident in close combat, whether they were 6 feet tall or 5 feet tall. So I developed new techniques, focusing on leverage and balance rather than just strength." The heavy-set biker suddenly spoke up. "The Henderson hold," he said with newfound respect. "That was yours, wasn't it? They taught us that in basic training. Saved my life in Baghdad." "The Henderson hold was just the beginning," Frank replied modestly. "Over the years, I helped develop 27 different combat techniques that became part of the standard Marine Corps training manual. Some of them are still being taught today." Sarah brought over a fresh pot of coffee, refilling everyone's cups as Frank continued his story. The bikers listened intently as he described the thousands of Marines he had trained, from regular servicemen to elite Special Forces operators. "I remember every class I taught," Frank said, his blue eyes clear and sharp despite his age. 27 years, 3,000 Marines. Some went on to become generals, others became instructors themselves, but every single one of them was important. The leader of the bikers had removed his leather jacket, revealing a Marine Corps tattoo on his arm. "Sir," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I think I owe you an apology. More than an apology, actually. The techniques you developed. They're the reason many of us made it home." Frank's eyes moved to the tattoo, then to the man's face. "4th Battalion, 3rd Marines?" he asked, recognizing the unit insignia in the tattoo. The leader nodded, surprised. "Yes, sir. How did you know?" "I trained your commanding officer, Colonel Matthews, back in '85, Frank replied. "Good man. Tough but fair. Always put his Marines first." The two ponytailed bikers exchanged looks of amazement. The reputation of Colonel Matthews was legendary in the Corps, and here was the man who had trained him, sitting quietly in a small-town diner. Betty Williams had tears in her eyes as she listened. Bill Thompson stood up and walked to the counter, placing a hand on Frank's shoulder, this time not in defense, but in pride. Sarah watched from behind the counter, finally understanding why Frank had remained so calm during the entire confrontation. "You know," Frank said, looking around at the faces now hanging on his every word, "the most important thing I taught wasn't any particular hold or strike. It was respect. Respect for yourself, respect for others, and respect for the responsibility that comes with knowing how to fight." The leader of the bikers stood up suddenly, his face showing a mix of emotions. His hands, which had earlier been clenched in fists of aggression, now trembled slightly as he reached into his own wallet. He pulled out a worn piece of paper, carefully unfolding it to show everyone. "Master Sergeant Henderson," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "I've carried this with me for 15 years. He held up what appeared to be a photocopy of a military training manual page. The heading read Advanced Combat Techniques, developed by Master Sergeant Frank Henderson, USMC. The other bikers gathered closer to look at the paper. The bald one's eyes widened in recognition. "That's from the original manual," he said softly. "The one they gave us in advanced training." Frank adjusted his glasses and looked at the page. A small smile crossed his face as he recognized his own work from decades ago. The diagrams on the page showed detailed illustrations of defensive moves he had created, each one carefully designed to help smaller or disadvantaged fighters protect themselves. "I was the smallest guy in my unit," the leader continued, his tough guy image completely forgotten. "They used to pick on me during training, said I was too small to be a real Marine." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Then our instructor showed us these techniques, your techniques. They changed everything for me." The heavy-set biker stepped forward, placing his bandana on the counter as a sign of respect. "Sir, I trained with your manual too. In fact," he turned to his fellow bikers, "how many of us learned from Master Sergeant Henderson's techniques?" One by one, all 5 bikers raised their hands. The 2 pommy-tailed bikers, who had been making jokes earlier, now stood at attention, showing the discipline they had learned in the Corps. The bald biker wiped his eyes quickly, trying to hide his emotion. Sarah watched in amazement as these tough-looking men transformed before her eyes. Betty Williams had moved closer to the counter, her phone forgotten in her hand. Bill Thompson stood nearby, nodding with understanding. He too was a veteran and knew the deep bonds that connected those who had served. "I can't believe the leader started, then stopped, shame clear on his face. "We came in here acting like bullies, disrespecting a man who probably saved countless Marines with his training. I've never been more embarrassed in my life." Frank reached out and picked up his fallen cane, which one of the bikers had quickly retrieved. He looked at the Marine Corps emblem carved into its handle, then at the group of men standing before him. "In all my years of teaching," he said quietly, "I learned that it's not about how tough you look or how loud you can be. It's about character." The morning sun now filled the diner completely, highlighting the medals and pins on Frank's collar. The same light that had earlier made the bikers' fake decorations shine now seemed to reveal their true nature. Men who had served their country, who had learned discipline and respect, but who had somehow forgotten these lessons along the way. "You know what today is?" Frank asked, looking at each of them in turn. The bikers shook their heads. "It's exactly 50 years since I finished writing that manual. 50 years since I put those techniques on paper, hoping they would help young Marines survive." The leader looked at his worn manual page, then at Frank. "Sir, would you?" He hesitated, then stood straighter. "Would you sign this for me?" The other bikers quickly searched their wallets and bags, pulling out their own copies of training materials, old photographs, and service records. Each one had, in some way, been touched by Frank's legacy in the Marine Corps, though they hadn't known it until now. Frank took out his pen, the same one he had used earlier to write in his morning notebook. As he prepared to sign the first piece of paper, he looked up at the group of bikers, seeing not the troublemakers who had entered his diner, but the Marines they truly were. Sarah brought over fresh cups of coffee for everyone as Frank put away his pen. The signed training manuals and photographs lay carefully arranged on the counter, their owners treating them like precious treasures. The morning crowd at Mary's Cafe had grown larger as regular customers called their friends to witness this remarkable scene. "Please, join me for breakfast," Frank said, gesturing to the empty stools around him. "Sarah makes the best eggs in 3 counties. His invitation carried no hint of the harassment that had occurred earlier. Instead, his voice held the warm tone of a veteran welcoming his fellow servicemen. The bikers looked at each other, uncertain at first. The leader spoke up. "Sir, after how we behaved, we don't deserve your kindness." Frank's blue eyes twinkled as he replied, "Son, in my 27 years of service, I learned that sometimes the bravest thing a Marine can do is admit when he's wrong, and make it right." Sarah had already started cooking without being asked. The smell of fresh bacon and eggs filled the diner as the bikers carefully arranged themselves around the counter. They removed their heavy leather jackets, revealing more Marine Corps tattoos and service pins underneath. "Tell us about the Henderson hold, sir," the bald biker asked as he stirred sugar into his coffee. "I mean, how did you come up with it?" Frank smiled, cutting into the fresh plate of eggs Sarah had placed in front of him. Well, that's an interesting story. It was back in 1964, and I had this young recruit who was having trouble with the standard defensive moves. For the next hour, the diner became a gathering place for stories of service and sacrifice. Frank shared tales from his teaching days, explaining how he developed different techniques to help Marines of all sizes defend themselves. The bikers listened intently, occasionally adding their own experiences of how these moves had helped them in real combat situations. "This flip move here," the heavy-set biker said, pointing to one of the manual pages, "saved my whole unit in Fallujah. We were pinned down, and I remembered what you wrote about using the attacker's weight against them." The two ponytailed bikers, who turned out to be twin brothers, shared their own story. "We joined the Marines because our grandfather showed us your training manual," one of them said. "He kept telling us that size doesn't matter if you know the right techniques." Betty Williams wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to the stories. Bill Thompson had pulled his chair closer, occasionally nodding in understanding at the military terms being used. Even Joe the mailman had returned, standing near the door with his mailbag, unwilling to miss this unexpected reunion. As they finished their breakfast, the leader of the bikers stood up again. This time, instead of trying to intimidate, he stood at attention. The others quickly followed suit, forming a line of respect in front of Frank's stool. "Master Sergeant Henderson," the leader said formally, "on behalf of my brothers and myself, I want to apologize again for our disgraceful behavior. We forgot the core values you taught us through your training: honor, respect, and integrity." He paused, then added more quietly, "We'd like to make it up to you, if you'll let us." Frank looked at the line of men standing before him, no longer troublemakers, but Marines who had found their way back to their training. "Well," he said with a gentle smile, "I do enjoy company during my morning coffee." Sarah, who had been watching all this unfold, quickly spoke up. "Frank's been coming here every morning at 7 for 60 years, she said. "Never misses a day." The bikers exchanged looks of understanding. The leader nodded. "Then, with your permission, sir, we'd like to join you tomorrow. And maybe the day after that too." Frank's face showed genuine pleasure as he replied, "I'd like that very much. After all," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "every Marine knows the importance of maintaining a regular schedule." 1 month had passed since that remarkable morning at Mary's Corner Cafe. The small diner had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. Every morning at 6:55 a.m., the rumble of motorcycles could be heard approaching the parking lot. But now, instead of bringing fear, the sound brought smiles to the faces of the regular customers. The 5 bikers, who had once tried to intimidate Frank, had become his unofficial honor guard. They would arrive just before him, parking their bikes in a neat row, making sure his usual parking spot remained empty for when his son dropped him off. Their leather jackets, once meant to look threatening, now proudly displayed newly added Marine Corps patches alongside their Road Warriors insignia. On this particular morning, the leader, whose name was Mike, stood by the diner's door, holding it open as Frank approached with his cane. "Good morning, Master Sergeant," he said with genuine respect, the greeting now a cherished daily routine. Inside, Sarah had already set up what they now called the Marines' Corner. The counter space where the confrontation had happened a month ago had been transformed. A framed copy of Frank's original combat training manual hung on the wall, alongside photographs of Frank with his new breakfast companions. The bikers had even convinced Mary, the diner's owner, to put up a Marine Corps flag. "You should have seen what happened yesterday," the bald biker Tom said as they all settled into their usual spots. "These 3 young guys were giving Sarah trouble during the afternoon shift. Mike just stood up, and they practically ran out the door." Frank smiled as he stirred his coffee. The bikers had appointed themselves as unofficial protectors of the diner and its staff. Their presence, once a source of tension, now made everyone feel safer. The story of what had happened that first morning had spread through the veteran community like wildfire. Every few days, new veterans would stop by, hoping to meet the legendary combat instructor and his unlikely honor guard. The twins, Jimmy and Johnny, kept a visitor's log, proudly recording the names of every Marine who came to pay their respects. Master Sergeant, the heavy-set biker, whose name was Bill, said as he spread jam on his toast, "Remember that kid we told you about? The one being bullied at school? Well, we started teaching him some of your defensive techniques. His mother called yesterday, said he's standing up straight now, walking with confidence. Hasn't had a problem since. Frank nodded with satisfaction. His teachings were still helping people, passed down through generations of Marines. The bikers had started a small self-defense class at the local community center, teaching Frank's techniques to those who needed them most, always emphasizing his lessons about respect and responsibility. Betty Williams, who had once been ready to call the police on the bikers, now baked them cookies every Wednesday. Bill Thompson had given them space in his hardware store to display Marine Corps memorabilia and Frank's training materials. Even Joe, the mailman, had started timing his route to join them for coffee, eager to hear more of Frank's stories. The diner's atmosphere had been permanently changed. The morning sun still streamed through the windows, but now it fell on a gathering of friends and brothers in arms, not strangers. The counter that had once been a place of confrontation had become a place of connection. "You know what next week is?" Sarah asked as she refilled their coffee cups. Everyone turned to Frank, who smiled knowingly. "My 94th birthday," he said quietly. Mike stood up, addressing the whole diner. "And we're throwing him the biggest party this town has ever seen. Every Marine within 100 miles is coming to celebrate." The regular customers nodded in approval. They had all witnessed the transformation, not just of the bikers, but of their whole community. Frank's quiet strength and forgiveness had created ripples that continued to spread. As Frank looked around at his new family of Marines, the morning sun caught the medals on his collar, making them shine. The same light touched the faces of his companions, no longer hidden behind dark glasses and fake toughness, but open and proud. His legacy lived on, not just in combat manuals and training techniques, but in the hearts of those he had taught to replace anger with respect, fear with confidence, and isolation with brotherhood.